Hello, and welcome to The Discount Bin. We're a podcast. We're going to be reading various book series. We're starting with the Broken Earth trilogy, which will be starting this week. But first, we are doing a bit of a dry run, testing our equipment, figuring out how to do podcasts and all that, and what we're needing. And so we're starting with a pretty popular essay, which is called Death of the Author. It's by an author called Roland Barthes. He's French. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name. Probably not. With me here, we have Lexi, who is coming from Nebraska. And we have Rick from over in Indiana. And we have Leonard, also in Nebraska. How's everyone doing today? Lexi, how are you?
I'm doing really great. Thanks.
Rick?
I'm exhausted after this read.
Yeah, that's understandable. Same. Leonard, how you doing?
Exhausted after the workday, actually.
All right, let's go through a bit of a. I'll just give a quick breakdown of what the essay basically said. I'm stealing this from somebody else's summary. So his argument is that the author has no sovereignty over his own words or images, sounds, etc. The final meaning of any written text belongs to the reader who interprets it. When we encounter a literary text, we need not ask ourselves what the author intended in his words, but what the words themselves actually say. Text employs symbols which are deciphered by readers, and since function of the text is to be read, the author and process of the writing is irrelevant. So, Rick, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think I took a little bit different from this too, though. I feel like that there's specific language criticizing those who do deep dive into these kind of texts, because when you associate the author with the writing, you're missing the actual experience of what you're reading. You're just attributing every little section of what they're writing to the style of the author. So using Robert Jordan as an example, or using Brandon Sanderson as an example, you read those books and you're seeing a Brandon Sanderson piece, which might take you out of the actual writing, or at least from a critical side of things. I feel like that was a major part in this book, or in this paper.
Essay.
I think this essay, thank you. And I also think that the other half of this was that you have to separate the art from the artist, because having these authors as a part of the dialogue with that, you're starting to take into account their personal views and their personal life and their personal trials as a part of reading it, and it's going to impact your judgment on that. So I think that it's really trying to say the best way to read stories is this way, not necessarily that this is how it's done.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And like, you bring up Robert Jordan, right? And he's, Wheel of Time is one of the most popular fantasy book series out there. And one of the big criticisms of Robert Jordan is he writes women terribly, right? And I think there have been interviews with him where, and this is just going off memory, where he said he just literally based every female character off of his wife. And so it's like, how do you take that information and not apply it to how you read the books,
Right. I didn't know that at all. I went through all those books several
really?
times at all. Well, I knew that he was awful at writing women, but
yeah.
He's also just incredibly too descriptive. An entire 2 pages dedicated to setting up a scene based on just the dude's uniform that we'll never even hear from again. Like,
yeah,
I love those books, but that definitely has a downfall.
For sure.
Knowing that he comes from a military background kind of tainted my view of reading a lot of it.
Okay.
But we're not talking about that. Well, not tainted. It's not really tainting. It's just like it made me read it differently than I would have read otherwise, right? Like, I know them going in this about the author. I'm going to start looking for those kind of triggers in this type of writing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Lexi, you have thoughts about the original essay?
I do. I do have a screaming baby, so I'm just going to wait for her to calm down a little bit.
Okay.
So that's not in the background.
Is it Leonard? Is Leonard the screaming baby?
Leonard, you didn't seem to like this essay very much. Can you say why?
I mean, I thought it's pretty dry for the average reader, right? The target audience sounded pretty narrow. Only people who are really interested in literature and like the concepts of it would be interested. Plus, understanding this concept doesn't really add to, enjoyment of reading, if you know what I mean. And also, I slightly disagree with some parts of it. I don't know if this concept applies to just fantasy novels or not, because if you say this applies to factual articles as well, like scientific articles. Let's say there's a piece of article on climate change. How would you be able to completely disconnect the author from the article itself? Because the author, who the author is, what they do, who they are, can contribute to the legitimacy of the article. Like if you like this concept of separating the author from the writing sounds great, because ultimately it's how the person interprets the writing. But what if the writing is not accurate in nature? That's where the author needs to be part of the conversation, don't you think?
I would as far as the average human consumption that we've seen, especially in the years of COVID, I 100% disagree. No one gave a shit what people's credentials were when they're walking around saying that they're gonna get fucking superpowers from the COVID vaccine. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think
Yeah.
critical thinking is always a part of that. Maybe for us because of what, like, how we digest things and how we are critical on things, but I don't necessarily think that's necessarily true for at least the loud segments of the population.
Well, I mean, I know where you're coming from, but I think that we should care. Like
We should.
that, I think that's the concern here, right? Like if we advocate this idea that this article is talking about, that's basically saying no matter how true every article out there is, it's okay for every reader to interpret it as they will, without the regard of what message it's sending.
I think
right?
that's ultimately what
So-
people do, though, right?
Yeah, Lexi, go.
Go ahead.
So two things. Right now we are straight up comparing fiction to nonfiction, and I don't think that this is an apt comparison, just because there's like scientific method and like peer reviewing that happens with like scientific studies. Whereas this, literally, you have somebody just like writing, and sure, they follow like prose and like structure that's been like defined by like the classics. But I don't think we can compare those. I don't think that's a fair comparison. Because one is actually using like scientific measurements and tools, and the other one is, I would argue, is not completely original, but it's from the mind, right?
I think a bit of what Leonard was saying, though, is that they're not necessarily using scientific methods, because you have to take into consideration the author's, credentials and, who the author is. And I will admit, when I read this, I didn't even consider nonfiction. I was just reading it in terms of fiction and like that author-reader relationship.
Yeah. One thing that go ahead.
The article doesn't, the essay doesn't really separate, saying that this concept applies to fiction only. It seems to just want to cover all literature in general, which is where it gets a little muddy for me.
I wonder. Go ahead.
So this is like a philosophical paper in nature, right? Because it's talking about how like all meaning comes from the words and not from the author.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well,
That's why I disagree. Yeah. I think the author should have some hold depending on the kind of literature.
The second half of this whole thing was basically about how none of these authors' words are original anyway, because it's just a source of, you're just basically, I mean, okay, so Daniel, you mentioned that this was basically kind of targeting towards, you mentioned it off screen, but targeting towards like academics, right? That are into this, and which makes complete sense, because this entire second half of this is literally about how you're getting your foundational writing skills from these other people. It's just like art. Like, sure, you made this really cool piece of art, but your inspirations are other artists. your most of this isn't just like it feels like it's coming from you, but it's not. Or it's like the concept of like, well, you're kind of in a well-to-do family. Did you really bring yourself up by the bootstraps? No, you kind of had all this stuff building you up to that point too. I mean, as a rough example or a rough comparison.
Yeah, that was my biggest takeaway. That nothing is truly original, and that you are really just, it's performative. These words directly from the essay.
Yeah, I did actually take a little bit of issue with that, because while it's true that 99% of writings out there are, just not super original, there are, as we advance as a society, there are like new things that come up, and there are original ideas out there. And they may build off of other ideas, but that doesn't make them not original.
Or, I mean, it kind of does, but let's take it into the video game sense. They're literally building their meta. Like this is them building their meta of writing style over. This is like Dune. It's kind of a horrible book. I'm gonna make this a really offensive podcast right out the bat. It's great, fantastic. It had a huge premise. It's set up like all of our sci-fi and fantasy like has roots to things like Dune. Dune's also not like completely original either. But like you try to go back and read it now, you're seeing all these kind of origin points, and so it just kind of feels rough and scattered as you're reading through a paragraph and you're shifting your points of view. Which back then, point of view shifts like that weren't really as common, I feel. But it's just like the rough draft of where we are today in the same kind of writing styles. Like, using like all of our big popular authors kind of just steal a lot of these old concepts and making them better. It's not like it does feel original, but it is just them making what was already there better, or attempting to.
Yeah, I'm just not ready to go so far as to say there's literally no original writings out there.
Daniel, they're all frauds. I say this right now.
That's fair. Okay, you convinced me. All right.
My finger up.
So page 8 of this essay, he talks about how it's up to the reader to determine what a text is saying, but the reader must do it without considering themselves. And I think that's like an unrealistic expectation, because you literally can't detach yourself from yourself, I think you can try to keep an open mind, and you can try to like view it from other perspectives, but you can't not be you.
Isn't that like essentially
I hate reading stories that I relate to the character in.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
1000%. It turned like I am done. Like part of the reason why I haven't finished Oathbringer is because I cannot make it through Shallan characters.
You associate with Shallan of all people,
yeah,
not Kaladin?
I want to associate with Yasna, right?
Oh, Yasna's
it's
badass.
just there's the cringiest shit that Shallan does. Like I feel embarrassed and I can't read. I can't do it. I hate it.
So back to Robert Jordan, I do feel like Brandon Sanderson also not the best at writing women, but he does it a lot better. But I still feel Nynaeve tugging her braid every other scene,
Yeah.
like just it's a little rough, but it's fun. It's good. But
there's a great like chart out there somewhere where it, somebody made a chart of each book and how often that Nynaeve tugged her braid, and then like some other really like meme tropes from that book.
Yeah.
Also,
though, I do kind of disagree. Yeah. I think you can take yourself out of the story just fine if it is enthralling enough book and you are seen from the perspective of the protagonist or whomever you're reading the point of view from. I think that's also like just being able to do that is a huge impact to your own personal character growth, not just in books, but in being able to step out of yourself is a requirement for growth. But
sure, but I totally disagree. Actually, no, you're just wrong. When Gollum tries to take, or let's say when Frodo is about to throw the ring in and then tries to slip it on or whatever, I forget how Lord of the Rings ends, but everyone can read that and just like read it completely different based on their experiences. And you can be as out of yourself as possible, but you're not going to ever be literally completely out of yourself and read it this exact same way. There's not like a one true way to read that that's 100% out of yourself, you know?
I'm just saying, like, you read this same book 10 years ago versus 5 years ago versus now, you're going to read it different each time too. It's not, it's you know, you read it with coffee, without coffee, you're going to see it different. You're right. You're not going to be completely detached. We are still chemical beings, but it's enough to where you're seeing it from the perspective of how they're aiming you in the story anyway. Yeah, you can't be completely detached, but you can still identify with different characters in different points of your life.
And that's the beauty of language, right?
I
Like
hate
that
that.
is why it's an artistic thing.
Yeah.
It's not precise, it's not repeatable.
That's
It's
totally
an art.
Yeah. Last point I had was this author talks about how he talks about how we're moving away from the age of the author and into the age of the reader, right? And he doesn't really he thinks it's a binary where you're either reading it from the author's viewpoint and like listening, it's only what they say that matters, or it's only how the reader reads it that matters. And I kind of think it's both that matters. Like I don't think it's this binary.
When was this written? This was like
60s, I think.
the 60s, or like,
1972.
are you just giving me a number, or is that real?
No, that's real.
Okay.
1972.
77.
Yeah, all right. It's 60s or 70s, somewhere around then. And yeah, why?
I'm just curious because like
Context.
it is context. This is when Dune came out.
True. Or maybe.
He's channeling all the
it's a
Dune
19
fans.
Dune was 65, but still, like, I that's such a weird concept. Like, how do you even digest that? Like, it's a reader's world. Of course, it is whatever it is, however you consume it when you consume it, right? Like, if you go into the book knowing that author's a dickbag and you don't want to read it, you don't want to like it, you probably won't like it. Like, as far as the author context, like, or the preconceived notions that you're going to build around that author. Like, Daniel, you hate Robert Jordan, so you're going to hate all Robert Jordan. I get it.
Yeah, pretty much. Wikipedia says 1967, by the way.
For Dune?
No, for this essay.
Oh, okay. So this is 2 years. Yeah, I'm probably gonna come back to Dune a lot because I think that's one of the earlier examples of like a breakaway that still has huge impact today in modern fantasy and sci-fi.
Definitely. And the movie just came out, well, a couple years ago, but that movie's amazing. I read only half of Dune, so I'll
Perfect, because that's the
pretend I
movie
know.
is half of Dune.
Yeah. There we go. I was just keeping up
You-
with the movie 10
you
years
did.
before it came out. Any other thoughts, Leonard?
Not really. I mean, I sort of agree with your point earlier. You can't really disconnect yourself from, like, as a reader. Take for example, the word beauty, right, or beautiful. And whenever the author describes something, let's say they say something like beautiful field of flowers. Everyone has like a different idea of what beauty means, right? They're gonna have a different imagination of like, oh yeah, probably this combination of colors. And what if the author said beautiful green field of flowers? The reader would be like, that doesn't sound very pretty, or that sounds gorgeous. Like there's going to be a bias. Every reader is going to carry some sort of bias, especially when the words are very generic like this. That you can't really take yourself out as a reader, because every word you are interpreting it at every moment you're reading the book. So yeah.
I agree.
I think another fun thought from this essay that is merely touched on is the motive of the writer. Whether it is to like make money, to try to cater to the reader and make it a reader's story, versus whether or not they really have something that they want to express and create. I think that's would be important to consider when we talk about context.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to. That's like probably one of the hardest things to judge, right? Like, how do you judge an author? If they're just in it for the money or if they just really love writing.
I don't think it's wrong. Like,
no, there's a great one though. Ready Player One, perfect example of a book completely written towards pandering towards the reader. Like, there's a story there, but it's pandering towards 80s nostalgia, 90s nostalgia the entire fucking time. And
it absolutely is, but do we know that that's the author's motivation?
I'm going to go ahead and assume so. That's up
mean,
to us. If we're going to be the final dictator on that, then yes, 100%.
Well, I think there's like reality in which there's a fact what he was motivated by, and maybe he just really loved the 80s, and he was like, I really want to tell a story that has
people. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're just reading an article about how we should disconnect the author from the content.
Yeah.
Now I'm doing the opposite. I want to connect it. Let's figure this shit out. That's what our new podcast is about.
Yeah, like
let's hunt down authors and figure out their motivations.
Yeah, cut them down. I thought they were so good.
All right. Anyone else? Last thoughts?
Your thought, Daniel.
Thank you. So we are starting the Broken Earth series. Our next podcast will be sometime. We haven't figured that out yet, and we're probably going to read the first book in maybe thirds or fifths, and break it up into 3 or 5. And if you don't know about the Broken Earth series, the author won the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 3 consecutive years, and she is the only one to do that. And also the only person to win the award for all 3 novels in a trilogy, which is very cool. And she has a 4th Hugo Award. Yeah.
N.K. Jemisin.
I was literally trying to find that, so thank you. Yeah. So that's about it. Oh,
she's so pretty.
Oh,
you're not gonna
good to know.
Are you guys all gonna do audiobooks?
So I already have the audiobook, so that's how I will be listening to it.
Same.
No, I'll be reading on my Kindle.
Like a schlub. I don't know what that is.
Schlub. Leonard, what about you?
Paperback. I cannot stand audiobooks, and I cannot really stand Kindle.
Okay, look at that.
I'm very traditional. I have to touch the paper to actually feel like I'm reading it.
I like to read my book while I eat breakfast, and it's really hard to do with the paperback. It's very easy with the Kindle.
I like listening while we're driving.
Yeah, me too.
Or doing literally anything else, not sitting there and reading.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I think that's wrapping it up then. Thanks for listening, and hopefully we'll have another one out shortly.
See you next time.
On Discount Bin!
Woo!
On Discount Bin!
On Discount Bin! Leonard, what the fuck? Sorry, is this PG?